Welcome to Marketing Demystified, the podcast that connects the dots for business leaders to drive revenue through effective marketing strategy. We chat with marketing experts on different topics that will help you ramp up your revenue. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen to us on your favorite podcast platforms. Marketing Demystified, the podcast, is presented to you by GrowGetter, your partner in growth marketing. And here's today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Are you ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered with actionable tips to transform your marketing game? You are in the right place. Welcome to Marketing Demystified. I'm your host, Jenn Mancusi, CEO and co-founder of GrowGetter, your growth marketing partner. You know how big of a fan I am of podcasting, and we're going to have a podcast episode today about exactly that. Podcasting really works, especially in B2B. It's a great way to connect, share, keep building your company, your image. Industry conferences now have podcast stages, like in person. More and more people, including in our industry, are starting podcasts. And most of all, if not all of them, need guests. So what's in it for the guests? In other words, why is having a podcast appearance strategy a good idea for your business? To discuss that topic, today I'm joined by Jessica Rhodes, founder of Interview Connections, which helps business leaders find the right podcast to be a guest on. Let's demystify marketing and podcasts together. Welcome, Jessica.
Hey, Jen. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm super excited to talk about this.
Me too. I have been such a big fan of a podcast strategy since I was sort of introduced to it. And there's always sort of a question of, hosting, guesting, and everything in between of what's the best sort of approach to participating in a podcast strategy at all. So I'm excited to hear your expertise.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a big question people ask. Like, should I host a podcast? Should I be a guest on podcasts? Or a lot of people that don't know about the podcast guesting strategy, they think, well, I want to use podcasts. I want to start a podcast. But then they just kind of dig their heels and they're like, but I don't really want to have a podcast. And then when they hear that you could do podcast appearances as a guest on other people's shows and still get so much of the benefit of podcasting, it just kind of lights their whole world up in it. And it opens up a lot of possibilities for business owners to connect with new audiences and their own audience in a long form conversational format.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I want to understand, from your perspective, why having a podcast appearance strategy is good for business. But maybe we could also talk a little bit about the advantages, the pros and cons of your own versus this guesting strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you have your own podcast, you own that media. So we're really talking about owned media versus earned media. When you have your own podcast, you own the show. It's your media. You have a platform where you are the leader. You're bringing on guests. You have a place where people can come and hear you every single week. Like, it is your hub. It is your show. And there's a lot of authority that comes with owning your own show. So there's a ton of benefits there. Now, earned media also has a ton of benefits. You are being invited onto other people's podcasts. By being a guest expert on other people's podcasts, there is immediate positioning and social proof. People see that you're being featured as a guest expert and they immediately assume, oh, they know what they're talking about. They're an expert. If other hosts want to interview them, that must mean they have value. So it's immediate social proof and positioning. It gives you so much content. And what I hear all the time from business owners that come to learn from me and work with us at Interview Connections is that their best content comes from responding. When people ask them questions about their area of expertise, that's when the best content comes out. Otherwise, if they just put a camera up and they need to make a video, they're like, I don't really know what to talk about. But when they are asked questions on a podcast, that's when their best content comes out. And that's a huge benefit of being a guest instead of hosting your own show where you need to really come up with the topics.
For sure. Yeah. And that, that external validation, or that social proof, as you mentioned, is so important and such a great benefit. But also there's the concept of the audience, right? Like, I have seen a lot of people start and abandon their podcast strategy because it's hard work to build up an audience. So, you have the benefit of that owned media, as you talked about, and that authority. But if you don't have anybody listening to it and you're not sort of dedicated to growing that community, then maybe it's a better option for you to get in front of the audience of other people's podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does take a lot of work to grow an audience for a podcast. So when people say, "Well, I want to start my own podcast," I almost always recommend that they're a guest on other people's podcasts first, because it's even if you're going to start your own show, you're going to need to grow an audience. Like, you're going to need to go be a guest on other people's podcasts to bring listeners back to your show, because there are still benefits of having your own show, even if you have a very small audience, because there's all the content, there's the networking with the guests, there's, SEO, you have just so much content that you're getting up on YouTube and your website and LinkedIn and social media. So there are a lot of benefits, but most people do want to have an audience. They want to have people actually listening to the content. And so being a guest on other people's podcasts is the most effective way to grow a podcast audience. Hands down, every single top podcast host will tell you that the number one strategy to grow their audience is to go be a guest on other people's podcasts, where all of those listeners, they listen to podcasts. It's a part of their content consumption. They choose podcasts, and that's just another big benefit of leveraging the podcast medium. Is in your audience, you have people that prefer audio content, you have people that prefer written content, you have people that prefer video and YouTube. People prefer different types of content. So when you add a podcast strategy, a podcast appearance strategy in, you could now be capturing a whole audience of people that were never consuming your videos or were never consuming your written content because they prefer audio, they prefer listening.
That's such a good point. And, sort of using the one to build the other. It's important. It's not a one or the other kind of strategy. Either you do this or you do this, but actually doing both kind of helps to lift up the performance of your earned and your owned media by participating in both, which is amazing.
Yeah, I talk about that all the time, how podcast appearances, your own show, they're most effective when it's at the center of your marketing plan, because you can repurpose the content into short form clips. Like, you and I could take this video interview, use AI and grab clips, and then upload it as a YouTube short, as an Instagram reel, as a TikTok. Take short clips from the interview and put it on LinkedIn, and then say, if you like this clip, you can go listen to the whole episode. You could transcribe the whole episode and now have written content, turn it into articles. You can use it with your sales, prospects, with people that have consults coming up, send them a link to your interview. So podcasts are my favorite type of marketing, because you can leverage them to make every other marketing strategy you're implementing more effective.
Oh, you are speaking my language. This is exactly what we kind of preach to everybody about. Really, any content, we talk about throwing the content a parade, and don't just use one thing for one purpose, but actually repurpose it for a lot of different channels and different strategies. But podcast really can be at the center of all of that, which just, it makes all of your, listen, every marketer out there is like stressed for time and pressure to like do all of this stuff. If you can have an audio, a written, a video strategy, all built from 1 hour of content, you're all of a sudden so efficient and getting so much more leverage out of the work that you're putting in, which is just incredibly powerful.
Yeah, the energy you get from, and let's just talk about how basically every podcast now is video. I have
Mhm.
done, about 20 podcasts so far this year, and every single one I'm on video, where, 10 years ago that was not the case. It was all audio only. So what's important about that is you're getting the video to leverage. We know how important YouTube is. It's so good for SEO. People like video content. People are going to YouTube to search for topics that they want to learn about. And so when you're on podcasts, you're getting the audio content, you're showing up in people's podcast, apps where they're listening to audio only shows, but you're also coming up in YouTube. You have a YouTube presence. And building up a YouTube channel is no small task. Like filming YouTube videos, I filmed a couple just like, I'm going to film YouTube videos. It's so hard to keep up with. I am not a videographer. I am not great at editing video, but I'm really good at speaking on podcasts. So I can show up and answer questions and give value and then take those video clips, get a good thumbnail and put that up on YouTube and, build my channel that way as well. So it's so good to really operate in your strengths, like find the places where you can create content most effectively and then repurpose, leverage it, maximize everything you can from each type of content that you're creating.
Yeah, 100%. Now, let's talk about like the different topics that you could talk about on a podcast. Like when you are focusing on podcast appearances as opposed to your owned piece of content or owned channel, how do you define the topics that you want to talk about? Is that driven by the podcast that you're guesting on, or is it driven by you, or some combination?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a dance between you and the host because when you're a guest on somebody else's podcast, they are driving the car. They get to decide what they're asking you. However, you also want to make their life as easy as possible. And so a way that you can do that is by having a podcast one sheet which has some suggested topics and questions. So I have a media kit and a one sheet where I say, you can ask me anything, but here are some ideas of what you could ask me to help guide the conversation. And what kind of topic should you write? Well, think strategically about if you were a guest on a show, you had an audience of, a couple hundred people, a couple thousand people who are in your target market. They're learning about you for the first time. They're meeting you for the first time through this podcast. What do you want them to hear you speak about? What is going to capture their attention and increase the likelihood that they're going to want to follow you and stay in touch with you? Enter your marketing funnel, enter that customer journey towards eventually investing in your programs and services. So you want to think about, well, what are the biggest pain points that you help people to solve, right? What are they most interested in? What do you want them to understand about your topic, about what you do? So it demystifies it and they're much more clear because a confused mind says no. So if you can make it super clear and have them really latch on to, oh, I get it, topics that set you up to answer questions, share tips and stories that make the listener feel like you're in their head. And when you can hit that, when the listener is like, wow, she's in my head, that's exactly what I was thinking. This is exactly what I've been wondering about. They're going to take your call to action. They're going to start following you and want to work with you, want to learn more from you. So you want to be intentional and strategic with the topics and questions. And always remember, this is a pitch free zone. This is not a webinar where you're selling. This is not a sales pitch. This is value, value, value. So the value should be intentional. So it grows your business. That's why we're all here. But it's got to be valuable and exactly what the listener wants to know about.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because especially when you are going on to someone else's show, they're not going to want you to be pitching to their audience either. It sort of works the opposite way you think it might by, going in there and saying, let me tell you all about our business. But that value add is so important. And I think that's maybe a content trend in general over the last several years. It's definitely one that we have shifted to of, content that is useful and helpful as opposed to with some kind of really hard call to action in it or, asking people to do something. And a podcast is no different. It's there to show your expertise. And, I love that you talked about sort of understanding like the getting into the audience's head, making the audience feel like, oh, she knows exactly what I'm struggling with or what I need help with. And like my little sidebar here is a plug for customer research and understanding who your audience is. That's, everything that we talk about here in marketing is made better by a better understanding of your audience. And so even choosing the topics and how you're going to talk about them, just made so much better by understanding who you're speaking to and what problems that they need solving. So
Yes, I love that because I love that you did a podcast episode about the customer journey. I totally
yeah.
agree. It's so important to know your customer journey and to know what steps they take. Like, what are they wondering about? What are they struggling about? What steps are they taking before they actually work with you? And of course, afterwards as well. It's so important that like one of the first steps you should take before getting into podcasting, whether it's hosting or being a guest on other people's podcasts, is who is your target audience? Who is your ideal customer? Who's your ideal client? You've got to know that because that is going to inform what are the right types of podcasts you should be on? Which ones are they listening to? What topics are they wondering about? It all starts with who is that ideal customer and what journey are they taking? Like, where are they at in their journey when they hear your podcast?
Mhm.
It's so important.
For sure, for sure. And that's such a good segue because, as we're talking about the topics and we're talking about the audience, what sort of things do people need to keep in mind when they're considering choosing a podcast to pitch? There's a million podcasts out there. So, I'm not pitching myself to go on, Smartless or whatever. I'm not a celebrity that everybody cares about my life story, but there are other podcasts that are more relevant for me. How do you know?
Yeah. So there's definitely some checklists to go through to know if a show is a good fit. I always feel like it goes without saying, but it has to be an interview based podcast. There may be a dream show that you're like, I want to be on this show. But if they're not doing interviews with business owners like you, they're probably not going to accept your pitch and they're not going to want to have you on the show. I would focus on established podcasts. So we look for shows that have at least 20 or more episodes. I was just listening to Alex Hormozzi's podcast, and he said 90% of podcasters don't make it past 20 episodes. So I don't know where he got that stat, but I 100% believe it because so many people start a show and then 4 months in, they're like, I can't do this anymore. This is way too much work. So you want to focus on those shows that have at least 20 or more episodes. That indicates that they likely have a bit of an audience that's consistently listening to every episode. Most importantly, though, look at who the host of the show is. This is a networking strategy. This is a strategy where you are given an opportunity to have a 30 to 45-minute conversation with a peer in your industry, with another business owner who is interested in your topic, who has the same audience that you have, but a different business, a different offering. And networking and building relationships, growing your network of people who know you, who have gotten to know you, that you can provide value to is so incredible. Podcasts that are producing episodes on topics relevant to you. We've already talked about all the content that comes from this. That's one of the biggest things I look at. I don't really worry too much about how big the audience is, how many listeners they have, how many followers they have. I'm looking at if I was a guest on this show and we talked about these topics, could I do something with that content? Could I promote that? Could I have a good relationship with this host? Like those are the first couple things I think about. And then of course, the size of the audience is kind of a nice bonus because it is a visibility strategy as well. But the content and the host relationship are the top two things that I'm looking at.
That's such an interesting tip because oftentimes that is the first question that guests have when considering going on a podcast is how big is the audience? How many listeners every week? And I love your perspective about, I sort of have the same feeling about doing any sort of in-person marketing, any out-of-home marketing. Like maybe the audience on that one street corner or whatever the case may be is small, but if you can use that, repurpose that later, the value of that digital content based on whatever you've done in person or based on that podcast, you could have 0 listeners, but if it gives you that YouTube content or that written content that you didn't have before, that's such a benefit, right?
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the in-person thing. Like I'm thinking about I have been to conferences with 2,000 people, like a marketing conference with thousands of people. And over the course of those 3 days that I'm at that conference, I'm probably shaking hands and meeting a lot of people, but I will get more leads, more clients, more value from the conference with 50 people And
Mhm.
we all get to know each other at a really deep level. Everyone is talking with each other, having multiple conversations with the same people. So you leave those events with a much deeper connection with everyone you meet versus like, wow, I got 100 business cards and I think I talked to each person for 2 seconds. That is, I think, kind of similar to being a guest on a really small, intimate podcast. Hosts tell me who have, and I had my podcast for 9 years and now I just focus on guesting, but I have kind of a 200 listeners per episode. And podcast hosts also echo that same sentiment. If they have around that size audience, like, I know the people in my audience, they're my
Mhm.
clients, they're my, followers, like they know me. And then the podcast that have like 20,000, 30,000 downloads, I mean, that is just so great. It's difficult to grow an audience that big, but those listeners do not have a personal connection with the host. Like they're listening a little bit more passively versus listening to a smaller show where they have a connection with the host and the trust with somebody that you really know on a personal level. Like you could send them an email, they'll respond back. The trust with them is so much higher than a host who's like kind of famous where you like their show, but they're not a personal connection to you.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I love the analogy of the conferences too, because it's the same. And even if you could be in that room of 2,000 people and not shake anybody's hand, but the content that you create post event about being there might actually get a lot of visibility or really help you in another way. And so those things are all interconnected. This is why that like sort of omni-channel strategy is so important, and using things, the same experience or the same strategy multiple times, reusing things to kind of maximize the effort that was put in initially.
Yeah, and I love this conversation too because it's not that bigger shows are bad and smaller shows are good. It's not that smaller shows are bad and bigger shows are good. You want to look at the entire picture. There are really big benefits to every type of platform and room that you're in. And so many people just discount a small to mid-range podcast because they're like, "Oh, it's not a big audience." But how much money are you going to pay to have content created for you? How much money are you paying for your SEO where you're going to get a quality backlink with every single podcast appearance you do? I know a lot of business owners that are paying, $500 to get one backlink on a website where nobody's actually going to read that content. So it's so important to really look at every aspect of podcast guesting. It's not just a one size fits all. I've got to be on a big show or it's not worth it. No, no, no.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So let's talk about the actual interview. I know actually a lot of people who are really smart and really expert and really nervous about being interviewed. So do you have any tips for getting ready for a podcast episode or a podcast appearance?
Yeah, for sure. So having an understanding of what the host is going to ask you is ideal. Like, I love that you and your team, set me some questions beforehand so I could read through them and have an understanding of, okay, this is kind of how the interview is going to go. Not every host does that. Sometimes you just go in and it's an opportunity to kind of improv and think on your feet. So, being ready to be present and think on your feet is huge. If you know the questions that you're going to be asked and the topics you're going to be asked, it's good to rehearse them. And I'm thinking about if you're like nervous and you're doing this for the first time, prepare. Maybe you want to write out your answers. Maybe you want to practice them out loud. I've had clients that tell me, "Oh, I have my wife interview me just so I can practice my answers." So how much speaking experience you have. Are you somebody that can just go into any room, answer any questions and you're not nervous at all? Or are you somewhere that, this is a new strategy for you to be a guest, to step on the stage, to be in the spotlight? Practice as much as you can, but don't let the practice hold you back from actually taking action because you could practice a million times, have your family interview you, but you've got to just get behind the microphone, start doing the interviews, start small. If you're really nervous, don't try to get on the biggest show that you can get on. Like, practice, be a really good podcast guest on the smaller shows and work your way up to the bigger platforms where you can really make the most of that visibility. So practice. I mean, just logistically speaking, we were chatting about this in the green room. Restart your computer, turn off all distractions, make sure you're well hydrated, check your microphone settings, your sound, your lighting, like get all of that in place because Distraction is the killer of a podcast. If you get distracted, somebody's knocking on your door, your phone rings, you're immediately taken out of that moment, and the listeners can feel that, the hosts can feel that. So the best thing that you can do is be super, super present and remove all distractions that are going to keep you from being present.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation. And I would say too, on the flip side, sometimes there's things that happen that you can't prepare for. Even as you're describing, like somebody knocks on the door or your phone rings or something, like, don't panic if something like that happens in real time. We're all human beings. People understand. So you want to take as many precautions as you can, as you describe. But you know, I try to tell people all the time to just like, don't worry if something technical happens, or it's okay. It's not the end of the world here.
I totally agree. I'm all about the humanness in this marketing. It's, we are all humans getting together for a podcast interview. And we're also all business owners that are using a podcast to create content, to connect, to gain visibility. Very few podcasters in business studied journalism and broadcasting in college. Like, we are not necessarily trained for this. So I always give a lot of grace for business owners that are podcasting. You really build up the skills of hosting and interviewing. But we're all doing our best, and let's just, focus on the content and building relationships. That's really what needs to be at the center of this strategy.
Yeah, for sure. And that's such a good point too. Like, we're constantly improving and like working on it. So whether you've been a guest on a podcast once or 100 times, it's so good to have people in your network to give you constructive feedback. I know that's been so critical for me, is to have people I trust that listen to the show or produce the show that can say to me, hey, I noticed this, or, have you ever thought about asking a question in this way, or here's an idea. And being open to that feedback, like, over time, you just get better and better at it and more comfortable. And I think that's so important too, to be on this sort of like constant learning journey. Because you're right, none of us are like experts at interviewing or journalism or any of that, but we are experts in what we're talking about. Often have to remind people of that. You are an expert. You have the experience. Trust yourself. You can talk about these topics in a really intelligent way, but also be trying to get better at our interview skills over time too is never a bad thing.
Yeah, I love that you have other people listen to the show and get feedback. It's so important to, have people audit it and listen to it, because you know what it sounds like when you're recording and the topics you want to be talking about. And I always recommend to listen to your own interviews, like listen back to your own podcast. I always hear like some of the really big podcasts that I listen to for entertainment, they talk about how they go back and they listen to every episode. That's so good. You're going to be your own worst critic. You're going to have a more critical ear than everyone else. But then other people, peers in business, coaches, mentors, producers, they're going to listen to it they're going to have a different listening of it. Your producer's going to listen to, the sound and maybe the flow of the interview. Maybe your coach or your mentor or your team can listen to it from like a strategic perspective of, okay, what are the topics we're talking about? What guests are we having on? So yeah, it's so good. And that just brings that value of excellence into it, of like, how can I, make this the best possible podcast?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Ryan, you're saying what I was thinking, the sound of your own voice. Like, it is so hard to listen to yourself on a podcast or a video. But it's so important to do it, because you're right, Jessica. It's like, just you're your own worst critic, right? So you're just going to help yourself get better if you do sort of invest that time to see how you're doing and improve on it. I think also I love the recommendation that you have for sort of like preparing, maybe writing down some answers if starter questions. Like, the conversation is going to flow. It's never going to be maybe some podcasts do, but it's never going to be one question after another. But having a little bit of a sense for what the topics are going to be and preparing your answers is never a bad thing. The one thing I'll say is when I take notes for myself, I don't write out complete sentences. And that's just my own, that works for me because like topic areas or keywords that kind of spark ideas for me are better than me trying to sort of read off a script, I guess. It feels more organic when I just kind of am flowing as opposed to reading. So, but I think it works differently for different people. And so you have to kind of find what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to have some bullet points, like find what works for you. And also, when just like a little tip for when you're a guest or when you're hosting, I like to think about it like a dance. I think I mentioned this earlier. It is a dance with you and the host because the host is going to be asking questions, but they'll also just say statements, they'll give their input. And so, kind of this is why it's so important to be really present and in the moment. You do want to read their body language, read the tone to know, okay, are we just having a back and forth dialogue or are they about to ask another question? And this truly comes with practice. It wasn't good about like this was a skill that was developed over time for me. And the more interviews you do, the more hosts you interview with, the more practice you have at it. But reading the tone, reading the body language, kind of getting a sense of that host style. Are they someone that just asks questions? Are they going to want a lot of back and forth dialogue? That's just important to be observing and working with.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of goes back to some of what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation about the having your own podcast and guesting on other podcasts sort of at the same time and using those strategies together. I'll tell you, if you've got your own podcast, other podcast hosts love interviewing other podcast hosts because there is something about that learned skill of reading the room and having these conversations. You want to have an organic conversation on a podcast, which can be challenging in a digital and virtual environment. It's not like sitting side by side with somebody. And so if you've got your own podcast, that's even more reason to find guest appearances on others, because I'll tell you from experience, I love interviewing other podcast hosts. There's something really fun about the energy that they bring to an episode.
Yeah, it makes you a better guest when you have experience hosting your own show, when you know what it's like to be on that host side of things. Talking, being a guest and a host, you will get better guesting when you're hosting a show. You'll be a better guest. No, opposite. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Exactly. That's exactly it. And so we already talked about maybe like repurposing the content from an episode, but how, as a guest, should you think about promoting yourself being on these other shows?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of really leveraging every interview you do before, like during and after. As soon as you are booked for a show, somebody, secured, you get the interview secured, get connected with the host, post on social media. I've had clients that got clients and leads and sales just from them posting, just booked an interview, like can't wait to record it in a couple weeks, I'll post it when it goes live. Like just actually saying I'm going to be a guest on a show, it does, like, people are like, oh, that's cool, tagging the host. So start building some excitement when the interview is initially secured. And then, day of recording, like I posted a selfie, got my microphone and my headphones, posted podcast guesting Friday, can't wait, we're streaming this. So kind of building the buzz around when it's actually recording. And then of course, when it goes live, you're posting about it, posting clips from it. I'm a big fan of leveraging the interviews, not just posting them out on social media, which is great to do, but using them in my marketing emails, using them with prospective clients. Like when somebody books a sales call with me, when I confirm the call, I tell them, I'm going to look through your website and prepare for our consultation. Please also learn a little bit about interview connections. Here's an episode, here's a podcast I was a guest on. This is a great interview to listen to get to know us a little bit more. So I use my podcast appearances to nurture my leads before the sales consultation. And that's a really, really effective tool because it's showing your leads that you're a thought leader, that you're an expert, that you've been interviewed. And it allows them to come to the sales call more prepared and nurtured. So there's a lot of different ways that you can leverage your podcast appearances.
It's so interconnected with we're being helpful, we're value adding, we're early in the customer journey, we're not selling people, it's just demonstrating your expertise. And there's so many different ways to repurpose. And it's a missed opportunity to kind of show up on a podcast, let them put it out into the world, and then walk away from it. So definitely leverage it in all these different ways, repurpose it, and use what the podcast host is going to give you too. A lot of times they'll give you clips or promotional tools. So it's a great way to really get the word out there.
Yeah, you can do so much with every interview. It's such a missed opportunity when people are not posting and repurposing the interviews because you have all of these leads and prospective clients following you already. People forget, they go out and do podcast appearances and marketing to get more leads in, but we often forget we've been in business more than a year. We already have potential clients following us, and by posting more, emailing, leveraging what we already have, leveraging these interviews to nurture and wake up clients that have already been following you. I signed multiple clients in July who have been on my email list for years, been being nurtured to the time when they're ready. And, podcast appearances, videos, social media content is what got them to that place. So leverage your marketing to nurture your existing audience.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining today, for your appearance on our podcast. I really appreciate you sharing all your expertise and experience with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And thanks everyone for tuning in.